Inclusion.
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 Inclusion podcast by the Centre for Inclusive Leadership.
Hello and welcome to Inclusion Podcast. My name is Chantelle Dusette. I'm the host for this session and I'm joined by my colleague Jagz Doheley, who is our client partner, and Paul Anderson-Walsh, who is the Chief Emotional Officer at Centre for Inclusive Leadership. I want to have a conversation with you today about authenticity, which is something, it's a word that gets used quite a lot, right? We hear talk about authenticity. And I think maybe it feels slightly overused as a word. But I don't think we should lose sight of its importance. So I wanted to just open that there and see how you sort of feel about that as a statement about authenticity.
No, it's a great point, because I think it may be an overused word, but I have to say I think it's an under-realised reality, because I think that if you were to actually say to yourself, what does it mean to be authentic, which obviously means to be genuine, to be true, to have agency is something we talk about a lot. I wonder, is it the case that many people are genuinely able to say they're living authentically? How many times, have we had the conversation about that lovely quote from Thurman, who says that each of us longs to hear the genuine inside of ourselves. And when we hear it, we know it. But until such time, says Thurman, you're like someone on the end of strings that other people are pulling. And I think the reality for an awful lot of people when it comes to this business about being authentic, Chantelle, is that they live a life on the end of strings that other people are pulling. And in our world, of course, where we deal with leadership, they're pulling strings that other people are on the end of. And that's saying, this is how you must live, this is how you must be. And I think it's a big, big subject. So for me, at any rate, I think that the reality is that life only actually has one question on the exam paper. That's it. It's a single question, and you've got your life to figure it out, and that is, who are you when you stop being who you think you are? And for me, finding our way to authenticity, I think that's the game right there. And if you can figure that out, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, who are you
when you stop being who you think you are?
Yeah, I think that's it. That is such a big question, isn't it?
That statement itself
is
so powerful. I think that sits really heavy, especially when you think about who you think you are. That completely opens a new way of thinking about who you are. Because you don't always look under the bonnet, right? You don't always look under what you feel, who you feel you are. For me, I think there's a lot of introspection needed. There's a lot of deep work needed, whether that's spiritual, whether that's psychological, whether that's, personal, therapeutic. It all needs to be ripped apart to see who is there. We live in a world where we grab things that we love about other people and stick them to us in a way that we feel should be who other people would want to see us as, and who we would like to portray. But is that truly who we are? Is that mask we slip on? Yeah,
that mask. And I think there is something actually about, we when we're born, when we come in, we actually know who we are. And then we're kind of separated from that, and then we come back to remembering. Is that metanoia, isn't it? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And it's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because it's hyphenated, isn't it? It's remembering. It's literally to being kind of taken back to where you were. And interesting that metanoia is about the idea of repentance, and that's about a kind of turning around in the seat of your consciousness, which is an interesting idea. I think this is a big piece, because I think, to your point about when you come in, is right, because I think that we all enter into the world original, but I think most of us leave it as copies, right? And frankly, imitations of other people. And I think that becomes the problem, that somebody once said there are two types of people in this world: a person who lives the life they don't have, and a person who has a life they don't live. And I think the problem is that many of us are in that second space. But why is that? It's to your point, Jagz, it's because we live and behave and assume the persona that we think we should have, right? Howard Thurman said that every one of us longs to hear the sound of the genuine inside of ourselves. Thurman said, when you hear it, you know it and you recognize it. But until that time, Thurman said, we're like people that live on the end of strings that other people pull. And for me, what makes that interesting is that I think that our listeners are certainly, many of us are going to be on the end of strings that other people are pulling. But an awful lot of them are going to be pulling strings that other people are on the end of. And you should do this and you should be like that. And so we have this very, conditional thing. And as we know, in the heart of inclusion is this notion of belonging, and we all want to belong. So we'll play the game and I'll be who you want me to be at the expense of my authentic self.
I mean, that must show up directly in corporate world.
Absolutely.
Carbon copies.
100%. 100%. I remember years ago, I used to run a performing arts school. Let me just clarify something by saying I didn't do anything to do with the performing arts. It was just my school, and I used to teach the identity class. But what was interesting about that, I remember the first group of students that we had in there, we did a morning with them about, your origin story, what brought you here. And there was about a dozen of the students in there. And each of them told a story, and they began like this. I used to be an accountant. I was a solicitor. I was this. And they all chose they were all talking about these professions that they'd escaped from. And I say escaped because they were wearing the armor, the clothes that their parents had assumed for them. You come from a good Asian family, so you need to be a doctor. You've come from this environment. You need to be one of those. And so, you know what I mean? And that projection as to who you are and what your future is going to be. Yeah. And it was really very interesting to see what happened, that actually the actuary is a ballet dancer. And you can go and see him now in the Royal Court. And whenever I see him on stage, it just makes my heart sing. I remember seeing him in The King and I just wanted to cry watching him there, because I thought, he's being who he is. Yeah.
And it shines through.
Absolutely. And by the way, when you're being who you are, it's not work, right? Because that's the problem. We're so wound and focused on this idea that we've been given that you have to be this and have one of those and go to one of those and do one of those. And so we've got this real problem that we think, which is why I think it's overused but under-realized, that what we do defines who we are. But that's not right. Who we are defines what we do. But if I don't know who I am, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, going on that, pulling that thread a little bit in terms of the corporate space, and how people can be on the end of others, on the strings.
Yeah, Thurman's point,
Why do we think, authenticity is really important, in the workspace? Why do you think it's important?
I think for me, when we start with that, even when you talk about the strings, we're not just talking about one layer of strings. There's multiple. People are in hierarchical structures where other people are pulling strings of theirs that are 3 layers up.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And that's where that piece comes into, is finding out who you are, to be able to step into your authentic light, to then unmask yourself, to be the leader who you truly are.
Nice.
And I think that core piece of unmasking, and I use that in the first reference, is because that's exactly what we need to do. There's layers upon layers of conditioning on us. And in a workplace, that is the space where we are mostly living our lives. And if we're in there most of our time, how are we going to be in a space where we're pulling on a mask, using so much energy every day, putting this mask back on, wearing things, being who we're uncomfortable being, where every time we leave work, we unmask, we undo everything and walk out as our true authentic selves.
Sure.
So,
it's exhausting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the word I would use, exhausting. So really, I was just tired listening to your point, because I was thinking it is exhausting.
Thank you.
No, sorry. I was exhilarated by the point, you appreciate. But no,
you made the point well.
It was beautifully made. It was beautifully made. But I think that what's interesting about that, though, Jagz, is the idea that when you think about that, then to Chantelle's question about why is it important in corporate life, it's important because if you want to talk about interpersonal relationships, let's suppose that you and I are playing the mask game, right? So we meet each other and you figure out that this is who Paul would like me to be in order to work here, and I think this is who I'd like you to be here in order for me to give you a job here. So we've kind of had that little game going on. The problem is that if we are in relationship and I'm not being myself and you're not being yourself, who actually am I having a relationship with? Mm-hmm. Because the whole thing is constructed on the premise of the false self. There's nothing authentic about it. And it's no surprise, right? And I love the point you made about when you leave the office, you feel exhausted. We've got a client that asks, you know who I'm talking about, that asks a really nice question. Their D&I team got a brilliant question they ask, and it's this: if a family member came to work, would they recognize you? And I love that, because it's such a great point, right? Yeah. Because are you someone completely different? And it's fascinating, you know, because of this inauthenticity, you can be one person between 5 and 9, and someone completely different between 9 and 5, 9 and 5, 9 to 5. Sorry,
How do you work?
Well, this is when I put my time in. You know, I do my work.
Like 5 a.m. 5 p.m.
Let's do that again. Between 9 and 5, and then somebody else between 5 and 9. Yeah. You know, literally, you can be two completely different people. And what happens if those two people meet each other? Yeah. Right? One of the things I remember as a child growing up, right, was when I was kind of discovering and having this whole voyage into my own ethnicity and figuring out who I was. My worst nightmare, having spent 10 years of my life being grown up as a white child and then coming into care and finding out I was black, the great dilemma for me would be if I met a black and a white friend simultaneously, because I was one person when I was with black people and one person with white people, but if they were ever to come together in the same space, I would not know what to do.
I do think for the audience, you just said something that I think we should probably unpack a little bit. When you found out you were black, can you just? Cause you just sort of said that really like.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Oh yeah. Black,
didn't you just? You mean you didn't find that out? How did you know? How did you know? Yeah, sorry. That does need a little bit context.
I think so.
It's a story for another day. But I was raised in care, and I was raised by a white middle class family as a child in care. And then when they died, I ended up going to an orphanage. Actually, returning to an orphanage. And it was when I was in the orphanage, the very first day I arrived in the orphanage, and I was the children were out, and I was sort of left with this nun, this Trinidadian nun, a very sweet lady, and she was sort of helping me sort of understand what was going on. And the kids came back from playing, and I was like, watching these children, thinking, what on earth is this? And so when we'd had dinner in the evening, I went to see her, and I said, Sister Agnes, I was 10, right? I said, Sister, if you know me well enough to know that this will not surprise you what happens next. I said, Sister Agnes, I think it's a bit of a problem. And she said, oh, what's wrong? I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to stay. It's very sweet of you to put me up, but I'm not going to be able to stay here. And she went, all right, okay. Well, why is that then? And I went, I don't think I can live with all these black children. And she went, oh, and she just didn't break stride. She went, And she looked to me very thoughtfully and said, I think I can help you with that. And I went, oh, good, thinking there's obviously somewhere where white children go, right? So she said, your father's black, you're going to fit in just fine. And just walked out and left me in the room. And I was like, what? I was like, what? And suddenly I realized a mystery was solved. I realized why. My hair grew up and everybody else's hair grew down. I kind of finally figured it out. But it took me 10 years to figure that out. Yes, so that was the answer to that question.
Story.
I know, it's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, no.
Oh, if only it wasn't a true story.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting because obviously, when you come into the workplace, you are who you are. And like you say, you have these hours and you spend so much time with each other. And then when you leave work, then again, what we're faced with there on the internet and social media, and what is it like to try and live on the outside, on the other side, when it feels a bit like your authentic truth might not be welcome. How do you straddle that as well? I think that's quite, how do you deal with that?
The inauthentic space. When you notice that others are being inauthentic, it's usually when you're already in the space of being your authentic self.
That's a really great point.
That is a really great point. Sorry.
I was That's such a great point. We both said it. That's a really great point.
So it's not until, I just want to unpack this a little bit, because we're saying a lot of things I think are just kind of like, like truth bombs almost, in a way, where people might have but think, oh my gosh, right, let me just stop and go back a little bit. So let's just play with this a little bit more. So when you start becoming authentic, or when the mask that we're talking about, essentially, when you take the mask off, that's when you're able to realize that you're in a space that is not authentic.
Or others may not be. So when we talk about that mask, it's you naturally at certain points that mask may slowly slip back on without you realizing because of those years of conditioning.
Right.
Because when you step into those spaces where you haven't been back into after years, and in those spaces you may have naturally pulled on a mask back in the past. If you haven't been there after you've gone through that work of becoming your authentic self, naturally it will start to creep back in because you're not sure of who to be in that space because you haven't visited there after doing the work. But when we talk about that, it's a lot. It is a lot. But I think when we talk about that, it's learning that when you start to see yourself as who you are and understanding how it makes you feel, how much energy it fills you with, realizing the drain of energy you go under when you're in a space where you can't be that version of yourself, you start to see people putting their masks on because you can see the difference of when they step out of that space because you naturally are able to feel it within yourself because your intuition kicks in.
Yeah. Okay, so question, is authenticity the key to happiness?
Well, I'll tell you this, inauthenticity is a guarantee of unhappiness. That's for sure. That's for sure. And I think maybe there is an interesting thing to say on that, Chantelle, which is that I think we've made happiness a prize, we made happiness a goal, but I think it's worth remembering that happiness is not the aim. In fact, I think authenticity delivers you from happiness. And instead of delivering you from happiness, it brings you to a place of contentment. And I think the problem with happiness is happiness depends on happenings. So if I have good happenings, I am happy. And so if I get a lot of likes on my Facebook page, I am happy. But whether anybody sees my post or reads my post or likes my Instagrams, if I know who I am and I'm authentically being myself, I am content.
It's fleeting. Happiness is fleeting.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's something you're always trying to catch, that dopamine hit,
exactly.
that moment of joy. But that joy cannot always stay there.
Totally.
We will naturally go through the fluctuations of life, no matter how hard we try to stay in this joyous space. But contentment in who we are and where we are, that is the true meaning of getting to the space where you can feel that leveling.
I love that. I love that because it's interesting, isn't it? Because you know that Hap was a god, right? And the thing about, and I think Hap is the god of, I'll love you if. So you can be unhappy or you can be happy depending on happenings. But there's no such thing as unjoy. That's not a thing, right? Joy is just joy.
Wow. Okay. That's a little thing that's gone off in my head on that. That was really lovely. Thank you so much. It's such a great conversation to have. So it's not happiness that's the key, that's the destination. It's actually being content, which I think, feels maybe a bit more, oh, really? Contentment? That's not as exciting as happiness, but actually, to your point, it's fleeting. And to your point, it's, if I have then, whereas contentment, it feels like it's the constant and that's more rooted. And as we say, change is a constant, so you can weather all of that. So that's really, really interesting and not getting pulled around, So, thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation to have with both of you today on this subject. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. It's been enjoyable.
Definitely. It's been brilliant.
Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you got as much out of that conversation as we did. Please keep your eyes out for socials. We will be updating you with the next session and topic. But for now, thank you so much and looking forward to seeing you on the next one.